So happy New Year, everybody, and yeah, welcome to the first Your DNA, Your Say seminar for 2022. It's fantastic to see everybody again, and so today we're going to be talking about the case of Costa Rica, and it's fantastic to be able to welcome Drs Raventos and Gabriela Chavarría from the University of Costa Rica, who are geneticists who've been involved in the Your DNA, Your Say project over the last couple of years, and so we're really looking forward to hearing from them. And so I will pass over to Jetty. Is it you starting?
So Happy New Year to all of you, and I'm also really happy to see you all. We decided to divide the talk of today in two parts. I will first give a small introduction about the country and our research group, because I think that different to other groups, we started this project as geneticists instead of social scientists. So I think it's important to give an overview of why we thought it was so important to participate and join your group. So without more delay, I will share my screen. As I said before, I'll give a brief introduction about Costa Rica and our research group. And then Gabriela will talk about the results from Costa Rica and also from Latin America. So as you can see, I hope you're seeing the second slide of the globe.
Yeah.
Okay. So as you can see, Costa Rica is a really small country here in the middle of the world. And it has a bit over 5 million in population. All these data are pre-pandemic, so we don't really know what happened, but in general, we have a very high literacy rate, a low fertility rate, high life expectancy, low infant mortality, and a very, we're classified, or we were classified also BP before pandemic as a high middle income country. As a country, we have a long tradition of doing genetic research, specifically from the University of Costa Rica, which is the oldest university in the country. And the reasons for being successful in doing so much research in genetics is that we still, even though the fertility rate came down in the recent years, we still have very large families, as I will show in the next slide. The family members live quite close to each other, and they're still very like Latin families, right? Very connected to one another. And even though some of the communication is difficult, we can get to almost all the country by car, and it's different to other Latin American countries or other countries in general. It's very safe, or quite safe, to go anywhere in the country. The population is very willing to participate in research. I mean, during the years, we've had over 90% acceptance. We have a public health care system that is almost universal. It's supposed to be universal, but with the political turmoil in the countries next to us, we have a lot of people with irregular migratory conditions. And also because of different situations that the pandemic has made worse, we also have a very high informal sector. So not everyone is under the universal public healthcare system, but over 80%. And this public healthcare system also has electronic healthcare records. So it's also very good for research. And the same ID that you were born with or that you got when you nationalized is the same that is used for the public healthcare system. And this unique ID number that is assigned at birth, you can go into a website where there's a registry of all the people with this unique ID system, and you can find the name of the father, the mother, the sibs, the children, marriages, etc. This is one of the families that we're studying now. As you can see, it's like a dream for any geneticist working on linkage studies. So different to other countries, we, instead of doing more genome-wide association studies in populations, right, in cases and control, we do more family studies that have several advantages that I will not go into, but these allow us to find genes of bigger effects than the ones found in the GWAS studies. These are just a couple of pictures to show these are members of our research group. This other picture is of a visit to one of the families and during the recruitment. It's interesting that also different to other countries, we have done the genetic studies and the research studies visiting the families at their homes instead of having them come in to the lab or to the hospital or to a clinic. And we have felt that this is much more convenient for the families, and also even the consent process. I personally feel it's much better because you have the family participating in their place where they feel safe and not in a hospital system. So we visit the families at their homes and probably during the weekends. And then we in some of the studies where we had to prepare the samples, immediately we even took a centrifuge in one of our cars. So we had like a mini lab in the back of this car. As you can see, some of the communication can be difficult, but you can get there. And this is our research lab in San Jose at the University of Costa Rica. It's the Center for Molecular and Cell Biology Research Center. So our research group has over 30 years of work in psychiatric genetics. We started mostly looking for genetic risk variants for different mental conditions, mostly bipolar, schizophrenia. Now in the more recent studies, we try to use not the DSM categorization, but more a syndromic characterization. So we use psychosis as the phenotype. And another study, because we also have a very elderly population, Costa Rica is one of the blue zones of the world. So we have been studying successful cognitive aging in a group of families where the proband is over 90 years old and has no sign of cognitive decline. Because we we recollect so much information during all our genetic studies, and these genetic studies don't have an application. We also have been exploiting this other information for studies that can have a more direct application for the population and for the country. So we have several publications on the different clinical assessment instruments and how to do a better diagnosis on socio-demographic characteristics of this population, including, for example, unemployment of people that have some mental condition or disorder. We have had some interesting studies on cultural differences, for example, on the content of the delusions between, because we have done collaborations with Mexico and the Hispanic population in the US. So this study was interesting to compare the content of the delusions in Costa Rica, in Mexico, in the US. And this other study, the priorities of people with lived experiences, because we have been working on also on helping define policy. This study, I was going to mention it because I think it's interesting because of the genetic hype of the last couple of years or decades. We were worried that having a public health care system and that most of the genetic findings are done in European populations and not in Latin America, as Gabi will show later on. We were worried that this genetic hype would have impacted the beliefs and the practices in our country. And that would mean like a pressure of the public health care system to incorporate some of these new technologies, although they probably are not useful for the clinical practice. I mean, this is important as a population research, but not necessarily for the clinical practice individually. So we did the study this is a qualitative study with interviews in which we included psychiatrists, psychologists, people with lived experiences, and policymakers to analyze which were their beliefs on causal explanations and public practices, and public policies. And we found that the beliefs are not deterministic. I mean, most people, all the people understand the complexity of these disorders or conditions. And on practices, these have not permeated yet our public health care system. Only the pharmacogenetic tests are being used in some of the private practices in psychiatric genetics. And this study that we started a couple of years ago with all of you, and we're very excited to later present the results. We are a very international group, as you can see. These are all the people with whom we have published in articles. Latin America seems very empty, but this is because we until the last couple of years, we started or we participate as members of two networks, one in psychiatric genetics and the other one in chronic disorders. The second one is called Latin Genomes, and it just started, I think, 2 years ago. And I think this is also interesting to mention because I'm not sure if it's because Latin American universities have a strong tradition on doing social or being involved with the community, or plus the research and plus the teaching. So in general, Latin American universities are very strong also in giving back to the community or working with the community. So I wanted to mention first this, the one that's here in at the bottom. When these projects started in the 90s, the people with lived experiences, and we found out that there was this need for support groups and having more information. So the first foundation for bipolar disorder that was created by the people with lived experiences and their families started in 95. Then in 2003, a foundation for schizophrenia started, and our research group has kept on working together with these foundations with information, new findings, videos to reduce stigma, etc. This video to reduce stigma was done with a grant of the Medical Research Council. So I think it's also important. Going up here, I mentioned that we're studying also what are the priorities for the people with lived experiences. And this was after we participated in the Delphi panel to study the barriers to global mental health. What were the grand challenges in global mental health that was organized by the Wellcome and the National Institute of Health. And we tried to replicate, it couldn't be done with the Delphi panel, what were the priorities in Costa Rica. So thanks to this, we helped write the first national mental health policy that ended 2 years ago. And this is one of our worries, that the data, and from the beginning, we were worried because historically, Latin America and other low and middle income countries have been participating in research more as the extraction of samples, almost like the museums, the musea in high income countries that have all the ruins, right? So from the beginning, we established material transfer agreements and samples, but with the new emphasis on diversity for the GWAS and in general for all the genomic studies, we feel that we have to work strongly on how to build equal collaborations between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries to respect the wishes and what the people consented to. So this is why when we saw the Your DNA study, Your DNA, Your Say, we thought it would be really important to participate and study what the people in Latin America think about sharing their data and who they trust. And with this, I leave Gabi so she can give the results for Costa Rica and Latin America.
Thank you, Jetty. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so as Jetty told you, I'm going to present some results from the Your DNA, Your Say survey for Costa Rica, but also some other Latin American countries. Okay, as most of you know, the Your DNA, Your Say is an international survey and it's anonymous that has been translated into several languages and which has been answered by thousands of people around the world. And the survey deals with the attitudes of the public regarding genetic and medical data donation for research. It includes a lot of information. It's a very broad survey. As most of you know, it includes social demographic information, willingness, what is the willingness to donate genetic and medical data for research purposes? What's the willingness to donate according to different uses of the data? Which concerns there are regarding data sharing? Which factors influence the decision to share your data? And also trust in different persons and institutions. So our relationship with the Your DNA, Your Say project started when Jetty read about the project and told us about it. We thought it would be very interesting to know what Costa Ricans think about sharing their data, what their views are. So Jetty wrote to Anna Middleton, leader of the project, and asked her if it would be possible to have access to the Costa Rican results of the project, and she said that would not be a problem. So we promoted the survey among our acquaintances and in social media and our students in order to get a sample of persons from the country answering the survey, and then we received access to the anonymous results. And with this information, then we were able to publish our first paper with the Your DNA, Your Say data, where we focus on some aspects of the survey, not everything, some aspects of the survey for Costa Rica specifically. It's important to mention that we consider our sample, for the sample we use for that paper, our sample is a pilot sample because it is not representative of the Costa Rican population. And because of the way we recruited, we just mentioned it to colleagues, students, social media, it is not representative, particularly regarding level of education. So it's very skewed toward persons with university studies. So this probably affects our results, as we will soon see when I show you some results. And then talking it over with Anna and Lauren, they gave us access to the to results for other Latin American countries. You can see here for Mexico, and with the sample sizes, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. And for these countries, we have larger samples recruited in a more systematic way. Okay. So now we're going to start to see some results, some very descriptive results for Costa Rica and these other 3 Latin American countries, but also in comparison to the whole sample. So taking the Your DNA, Your Say sample as a whole with all countries for comparison. What we're seeing in each of these graphs for the y-axis is the percentage of persons who said, I would be willing to donate. And in this slide, we're focusing on willingness to donate depending on the use of the data. Okay, so in this first one, we can see that when the user of the data is going to be a medical doctor, the willingness to donate in Costa Rica is very, very high. It's over 80%. As I told you, this is probably influenced by the fact that the sample is not really a representative sample, but then we see in this group of people who answered a very high willingness to donate their data to medical doctors. Then we see for Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil, we see that the willingness to donate is similar, around 60%, and it is higher than what we have for the whole sample, including all countries. When we move over to non-profit researchers as users of this data that is being donated, in Costa Rica, the result is even higher. The willingness to donate is even higher than for the medical doctor. And then for the other 3 Latin American countries, we see high levels, Mexico a little higher here, but we see high level of willingness to donate to non-profit researchers. And it is higher than what we see, again, it's higher than what we see for the whole sample. This changes completely when we move over to for-profit researchers. We can see that willingness to donate drops dramatically, especially in Costa Rica. We go from especially high to especially low when we're talking about for-profit research. Then Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil show similar levels of willingness to donate, but you see it's around 40, less than 40%, let's say, and here it was around 60. So it is greatly reduced when the use of the data is going to be for-profit. When we take the sample as a whole, we see that it was also, willingness to donate was also greatly reduced. And this is something that has been found and previously published in the literature. And it probably has to do with the fact that when people donate their data, the motivation behind it is often altruistic. You want to help society, you want to help your country, you want to help other people with the disorder that's in your family, for example, in our case. And if your motivation is altruistic, then you don't like it when someone's going to profit off of your data. So this is a summary of willingness to donate. And then we move over to another part of the survey, another very interesting part of the survey that deals with trust, where people are asked, would they trust these persons or institutions? And it's a long list. So here I'm just showing you a few of the items of this trust section. So when people are asked, would they trust their own medical doctor, for example, their own medical doctor with their genetic and medical data, you can see that for all samples, the level of trust is very high. Again, in the y-axis, what we have is the percentage of people who said, I would trust this person with my data. So you can see that the level is pretty high for all samples and similar for all samples. When the question is, would you trust any researcher at a university in your own country with your data? We can see that in Costa Rica, it's again especially high, over 60%. And then for these trust results, we sort of see a pattern where Argentina and Mexico group together and Brazil is more similar to the data for the whole sample. So for Brazil and Argentina, we see that trust level for a researcher at the person's own country, it's around 40%. And Brazil and your DNA sample are somewhat lower. In this case, in the case of Costa Rica, for example, for which we know the context the best, in Costa Rica, historically, most research has been performed at public universities, very frequently with public funding, and there is not a long tradition of association between academia and private companies for research. So when you ask a Costa Rican about research at a university, they're thinking about a public university and they're thinking about nonprofit research. So it would be interesting to know when we have a representative sample in a second phase of the project, which is what we're working on now, how these results will change. Okay, so when we move over to trust in any researcher, but at a company in the person's own country, we see again Costa Rica drops dramatically, but all samples do, again, because we're talking about a company. But we see Mexico and Argentina together, and Brazil and your DNA or sample as a whole with somewhat higher levels of trust in researcher at a company. So it will be interesting in the future to explore these differences between the Latin American countries. For example, what could be, go deeper into what differences in the research tradition there are between Brazil and other Latin American countries, for example. And just to show you an additional result, when people are asked about trust in the government of their own country, they're all pretty low. And interesting for Latin American countries, all lower than your DNA or sample in trust in their own government. Okay, so if we move, and then now if we move over to another whole section of the survey, this is a part where people are asked about their concerns regarding donation of their genetic and medical data. So in the whole survey, the people are being asked about anonymous donation, but at some point they are told, if your genetic information could be linked to your personal information, what would be your concerns? And this is asked in different ways. Here we're focusing on the results when they were asked, name your top 3 concerns out of a list. The list includes 11 different concerns that people have, and this list was created by asking open questions to people before the survey, asking open questions, what are your concerns? And then from the most frequently named ones, the list was created. So as you can see in this table, if we take Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil, and look at their top 3 concerns, they are the same ones. They switch in in the rating. For example, Argentina has different positions for these two, but they are the same. And the concerns are my DNA being copied and planted at the scene of a crime, being cloned, and upsetting my genetic relatives. These are the three top concerns in these Latin American countries. In Costa Rica, we also have my DNA being copied and planted at the scene of a crime, upsetting my genetic relatives also, but this one's different. Health or life insurance companies using the information to discriminate against me, which probably reflects the difference in our sample. And when we look at the sample as a whole, again, we see my DNA being copied and planted at the scene of a crime and being cloned. So as geneticists, this result is very interesting for us because we would interpret it as the influence of the popular culture, TV shows, films, books, influencing how people view genetics and what's possible with genetics. Because, for example, cloning is something that is very, very difficult to achieve. So it's interesting to see that would be a top concern for a person, that they could be cloned from their DNA. And also this one about my DNA being copied and planted at the scene of a crime, because you would have to think, who's taking the DNA? Why are they planting it at the scene of a crime? Because you donated it to a research project. And then this is somehow being linked to fear of it being used to frame you for a crime. So this is for us definitely interesting results. And then the other thing we would like to point out here is that for all Latin American countries, we find upsetting my genetic relatives as one of the top three concerns. And our guess would be that this is something very Latin American, because as Jetty told you before, in Latin America, we have a very close relationships with our family members. You meet very often with your direct family and with your extended family. So it's a very close relationship where it would be natural that you worry about upsetting your relatives because their DNA is similar to your DNA. So any information that someone would get from my DNA would also give information about my relatives, and they could not like it. So this worry about the relatives seems to be a constant in Latin America, and it would be interesting to see if this is true for all other regions of the world with a very strong family structure. When we look at the whole sample, upsetting my genetic relatives was in position 8. When I just rated the frequency with which it was named, the concern, it was 8 out of 11. So this seems to be very different. So with just these three areas of the survey that we covered, as you can see, there are many different analyses that can be made with the results of the survey because it is very broad. Many different comparisons that can be made within and between regions of the world. So this is something that as soon as we have a larger sample for Costa Rica, we will perform a more in-depth analysis for Latin America, and this is something that can be done for all the rest of the countries, of the participating countries. And then finally, we wanted to relate this to our area of study, which is genetics. And as Jetty told you, diversity is something that is being very often discussed in the last years regarding genetic studies. So as you know, most of them, like the gold standard for studying the genetic basis of complex disorders in the last decades have been the genome-wide association studies. In these studies, you compare the frequency of genetic variants between a group of cases or affected people and a group of controls or unaffected people. And then what you find is statistically significant differences between the frequencies of these variants, of these generic variants. And the promise, and in the last years, the practical application of the GWAS that is being proposed is, for example, in the use of the polygenic risk scores, where information from all these associated variants is taken together, and then a weight is added to each variant according to its effect size, how large is the effect on the trait, And then a score is calculated for the person, which the idea is that eventually it could be used in the clinic to predict what the risk of a person is for developing X disorder, like, for example, cardiovascular disease. How well this can be done is something that is under discussion, but this is the idea. And then what's the problem? That most of these genome-wide association studies have been performed on persons with European ancestry. And this is what we see in these two graphs, these two figures. So here we see, like, from the GWAS catalog, so for all disorders, over time, what has been the composition of the samples used in terms of ethnic origin. And you see that almost all the samples in red are of European origin. And if we look at us, Hispanic Latino ancestry, it's almost non-existent in GWAS studies. The same is true for Africa. The same is true for many other regions of the world. And if we focus on psychiatric disorders, which is our area of interest, and these are just different psychiatric disorders, major depression, bipolar, etc., we see that also the Hispanic population is almost completely absent from these samples. What is the consequence? The consequence is that, for example, if you calculate a polygenic risk score, it's not as good at predicting risk in the populations that were not included in the original studies from which the variants came. So attention has been focused on this issue in the last years, and there is like a conscious effort now to increase diversity in genetic studies. And so going back to the relationship with the Your DNA USA project, we can see that in Latin America, there's a tendency to have a high willingness to donate genetic data. So it's possible to recruit Latin American samples, and people would be willing to participate. Ideally, this should be done in the countries because for many databases, the Latin American samples come from Mexicans in LA, etc. So ideally, this should be done for people living in their own country, recruit the sample. There seems to be a high willingness to participate. And then we run into two challenges, which are funding. First, number one is funding. So in Latin American countries, it will be very difficult to find funding to perform one of these very large studies. So what usually happens is that the Latin samples, for example, would be sent to one of these consortia that work on complex disorders, for example. So funding is one challenge. And the other one is a fair treatment of, like Jeti mentioned before, a fair treatment of the researchers involved if this is in the context of research project, of the researchers involved in recruiting this sample, and also a fair treatment for the people who participate in the project, and making sure that what they consented to originally is being honored through time. So for this, it would be important to have some more specific guidelines, as Jeti has suggested. So with this, we finish. We would like to thank the Costa Rican institutions and the international institutions involved in the project, and we would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much to both of you for that. That was absolutely fantastic. And it's also really nice to see the kind of connection between the kind of social science and the genetics, and the way that they can kind of, that it can usefully all come together. I think so. We have I think you can put questions in the Q&A. You can probably put questions in the chat. There is a facility to put your hand up, and I think it's possible we might actually be able to have people kind of asking questions in person. If not, I can read them out. And maybe just whilst people have a think as well, I just wanted to ask one question. I suppose that one of the I suppose in the work that we do have done around data, one of the things is the way that genetics and genomic data gets caught up in bigger discussions about data and Facebook and mobile data. And I wondered, to what extent is that part of the kind of general public discourse in Costa Rica? Is there a kind of general concern about data and who's using it and who's collecting it and things like that, that's background to this study?
Do you want me to start?
Yes.
Okay. I would say that in general, people are very trustworthy on their data. And so a lot of people participate in all these studies and in social media without bigger concerns. Nonetheless, in the last year or so, there was this big scandal because the government had a unit that was going to collect personal information of people and try to define policy with data, which is something that governments do. But because it was surrounded by secrecy, this unit, this special unit, so there was a big scandal. And so having your data by the government is an issue and has been discussed in social media. Nonetheless, I think that social media still could be, and I have no empirical data to define if this is true or not. I believe, and we have to check it, that social media usage is a bubble in the country. So I'm not sure that the topics discussed and this scandal was really widespread across all the groups in the country.
Okay.
I don't know if Gabi wants to add something.
No, just I think you covered it. I think it's yeah, we see it in social media. I'm also not sure how widespread it would be, and it's relatively recent. So this as Jyoti mentioned, this scandal was a couple of years ago, and before that, I don't think most people were worrying about their data. We tend to be trusting, put a lot of information on social media, etc.
Thank you. I suppose it's kind of interesting the extent to which where the genetic data is kind of something different, or whether it gets caught up in these kind of other things. So I have a question which is from come in. So I suppose it's about the idea that the consultation has become a kind of way of talking to people, but not necessarily listening to people. And I suppose the questions are kind of around the responsiveness. Is there an extent to which the way in which I suppose the kind of policy in Costa Rica, because you mentioned that I think the studies as well, you have that kind of very strong link with communities. And is there how responsive is policy to these kinds of findings and the kind of findings that you're producing?
I think this is a great question because by the way it's worded, I think it's completely to the point. I mean, sometimes or a lot of times the consultation is a requirement, but it's once you do it, it's okay. You don't necessarily bring that consultation into policy. And that's what we have seen also in Costa Rica, as I mentioned in the other study about how the priorities felt by the people with lived experiences are then incorporated into the policy. There's a big gap. So although it's politically correct to have consultation, and it seems if we had consultation, that's enough. When you read the policy that comes out and is supposedly written with the public participating, there's this enormous gap where the priorities, for example, in mental disorders and conditions, a priority for the people with lived experiences is to work on stigma. And stigma was the top one priority. And when you see the policy, there is not one action on stigma. So I think this is an excellent question. And I think we have the same problem that although it's done mostly because it has to be done, but then it's not incorporated. So we have to work on that.
And then the other aspect is, for our research, it's much easier to incorporate what we're seeing in the answers of the participants, because then we can see what people mostly care about. There are also, as you know, the survey is very, very long. It's pretty long. And there are many other questions being asked. And in one part, people answer what would influence their decision to donate their genetic data. And they are asked, for example, if knowing who will use it, having some sort of control, having direct contact with the people who have your data, or getting access to your raw genetic data. That is something that I would like as a geneticist if I participate, but I don't think that it would be so important for most of the people. So for us, it's very interesting to have this information, and we can incorporate it in our consent, for example.
That's interesting to see kind of how it can make a kind of change the research practice, I suppose. I think that's one of the ambitions as well, to kind of have this for the study to inform that. So I have another question as well, which was about whether you'd, because I think that question about the kind of the relationship between research in Costa Rica and the research being done in Costa Rica or being done in kind of other areas of Latin America, rather than necessarily kind of shipped out to the consortia and things. And I was wondering whether you'd looked within the questions into the kind of trust in researchers and companies and things working overseas, as well as those in your own country, or whether that's kind of data that's
yeah, I didn't include that result, but it's even lower. Everything overseas, it's even lower than in the person's own country. So it goes down for the companies, but when it's a company outside of your country, it's even lower, yeah. And sorry? No, so anecdotally, we were talking about that recently in one of my courses with the students, and then some of them had worked in research projects, and they had very different experiences. So one of the students had worked in a research project from the university, and she said participation was incredibly high, and people were very willing to share with them and sit and talk. And then another one had been involved in recruitment for a study for a pharmaceutical company. And he said they needed, I don't know, triple so many hours to get the sample because everybody kept hanging up on them.
Oh, fascinating. That's,
yeah. So it's a completely different experience depending on who's doing it. Mm-hmm.
And is there a direct consumer genetic industry in Costa Rica, or is there?
It has started. I tried to find out how many samples from Costa Rica were in these US-based companies, because people send their samples directly, but we still haven't found out. Mostly people do for ancestry, not for disease-oriented. And in some of the private labs, they're offering pharmacogenetics, and these are being used in the private sector. But as I mentioned, most people in Costa Rica are still go to the public system. So our worry was that the pressure of the companies would make the public have to start these tests. But for the moment, this has not happened. There's this other question.
Yeah.
Continuing.
Yeah. Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I believe, or my hope is that we should incorporate, or we want to incorporate what we're finding in our future research projects, in the consent forms, and also I mean, we're trying to work with international networks so that our samples that are sitting in the labs of high-income countries, if they're going to be used in future research, there has to be an IRB approval in the local country again, and not only keep on using them for 30 years, right? So this has to stop. And for future projects, we have been working with these Latin genomes, and there's a very interesting proposal on a dynamic consent form that we thought we would want to try, in which every new goal would be again reconsented. And with the very widespread use of cell phones, etc., it would be kind of easy, right? If you were going to do a new test, then you would first consent the person. This is going to be done with, I don't know, this international network. Do you consent or not? So I do hope that this is the start of a more ethical way of doing genetic research.
Yeah. I do hope so. That's, I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I suppose, and is that that's one of the kind of interesting things with dynamic consent is whether it, you know, the kind of, I suppose in familial disease and rare disease conditions where it seems to work very well, then you move to a population scale and it's maybe more difficult to manage. And what kind of I suppose populations is that proposal with? Is it?
The one for the
Yeah.
These I see somewhere, these are all adults and family studies, but we don't recruit. Well, I mean, most studies are done with adults. Mm-hmm.
So I just have one more question, because I could kind of, the problem with these seminars is basically I could just keep asking people questions all day, and I have to let people escape. But I suppose one of the interesting things is it was really interesting, that concern about kind of upsetting your genetic relatives, and particularly I suppose the idea that might be particularly to do with the way that people kind of relate to their families in Latin America. And I suppose if you were going to take that forward and ask more questions of those people, what kind of things would you be interested? Where would you take that next? How would you extend that? Really interesting area.
One of the examples, I'm not sure if this goes to your question, but one of the examples that we've had when we visit families and do the family studies is the mother who doesn't want to do genetic research with their children because the father is not the father.
Okay.
So we have had that. And I mean, this is just one of the examples that so people know enough about research and genetics, that their genetic information can be used for other things. So I think that making sure that there's clarity on how much we should use that information, and limit it to only what the people consented to. I don't know, Gabi, I don't know if I answered.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm also thinking, what more could you ask to make sure what we're measuring? I guess that was your also where your question was you could go deeper into this subject, and to make sure how clear it is that if, for example, a result for a variant of risk for breast cancer, for example, if we found it for you, what would the consequences be for your relatives, that they could have it or not? Or maybe we could explore further if this is what is going on when people say upsetting my genetic relatives, right? Or upsetting in which way? Because there's another option that says family members knowing something about me that I didn't want to tell them. and this one doesn't show up. So that is not, so that is
Okay.
not it. It's upsetting my genetic relatives. And there's like a parenthesis there where it explains more, because my relatives share my DNA. And this is the one that was chosen. And it's certainly interesting that it was chosen in all Latin American countries. It would be nice to look for it where it shows up, where this option shows up in the world. I guess in your data, it would be nice to
For
know.
example, no, for example, in the US, we have, in the studies we do with people in the US, the subjects we recruit are afraid that the father or mother or SIP will know that they have bipolar disorder, right? And that is not an issue in Latin America, because the whole family knows what you have.
Interesting.
So the issue is more that if I do a genetic study, I don't know, but it's different. It's not the illness or the characteristic. So yeah, we have to follow up on that question.
Yeah, we could think about questions surrounding this item that could clarify what's going on or what people are thinking. Yeah,
I think that's one of the things that's really interesting, is that once you start to, I mean, across the whole study, once we start to have these kind of differences, and then like, how do we understand in more depth the differences that we're finding, and then to be able to kind of build a richer picture around them. But we are running out of time. I just wanted to say thank you so much again for and for the talk and for the analysis and for being part of the project. It's really, it's wonderful to be able to talk to you.
Something I wanted to mention just before we go, and I forgot, is that this project is an example of one of the good collaborations, one of the good international collaborations. It has been great working with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to also say that, I mean, it's been so much fun and we have learned so much.
Well, hopefully it's just the start. And yeah, so thank you everybody as well for coming and coming along today. And yeah, we don't have our next date set yet, but as soon as we do, we will send out an email, and hopefully it won't be too long before we've got a firmed update for that. But yeah, so yeah, have a good day or rest of day or morning or evening or afternoon.